While I was living and working in Hungary as a Fulbright Research Fellow in 1987 and 1988, studying mortality patterns in the country, Easterlin's theory about links between economic and demographic cycles was in the air. People were arguing about whether the ideas that he had developed in the context of the United States experience could be generalized to other countries. While I was collecting statistics on death rates in Budapest, I went ahead and got my hands on as much data as I could about birth rates at the same time. I also ran into the work of a Hungarian economist, János Kornai, who was working in a different building from mine up inside the Castle district in Buda. A couple of years after I came back to the United States, I was attending an international conference in Paris when suddenly all of these pieces came together. I was sitting in the back of a lecture hall listening to a conference presentation and also fiddling with some statistical analysis on my primitive laptop computer. I noticed that instead of the parallels between labor force and birth rates that Easterlin suggested, the birth rates in Hungary seemed to move in exactly the opposite manner. When I reversed the sign on one factor in the computer model from positive to negative, the chart for Hungary that appears in the article appeared on my computer screen. I knew I had something. I got up and left the hall to sit outside and think about what it might mean, but it was not until several months later that I realized that Kornai's work offered exactly the explanation I was looking for, the reason why Easterlin appeared to be standing on his head in Eastern Europe.
Nearly all of the comparative studies testing Easterlin's hypothesis linking cohort size and birth rates involved a series of studies of American society by demographers, historians, economists, and others. Eventually, these efforts branched out in new directions, looking for Easterlin effects in different countries in Western Europe, including the work by Pampel. It had not yet occurred to anyone, apparently, to consider whether these Easterlin cycles also might manifest themselves in the countries behind the Iron Curtain in Eastern Europe. Modifications would be required to the theoretical foundations, of course. The standard outline of the hypothesis is well known. Small versus large generations of young adults are supposed to encounter very different consequences when they begin to enter the working ages, with a small generation facing less internal competition, enjoying more career success, and so marrying earlier and forming larger families. The resulting large generation then faces stiffer competition, higher unemployment, and other economic penalties that lead them to delay marriage and parenthood, completing the cycle by producing another small generation. This familiar alternation of small and large generations emerged from Easterlin's original analysis of the United States in the mid-20th century. The aim of every comparative study based on his original model is to determine how much of it fits the other times and places, and how much the model must be modified in order to understand fertility patterns in such contexts. In order to get a coherent picture of the varying results, it is useful to frame them in terms of the checklist of conditions that have been built up by these comparative studies. Some of the items on the checklist were established by Easterlin himself in his original research on these cycles. For example, the very foundation of his theory insists on a competitive labor market in which each new generation must find its place. This condition, in Easterlin's estimation, always has existed in the United States. As he learned from his work with Kuznets, the early history of the United States also was built on a foundation of massive, mostly unregulated immigration from many countries of origin. This tradition of immigration actually negates one of the conditions on the checklist, because Easterlin concluded that his cycles did not happen in the decades prior to 1930s, when restrictions on immigration were low or even non-existent, and people arrived in their millions to find their futures. At that stage in history, deliberate attempts by the government to manipulate the economy through policy actions also had not yet developed. So the country was subject to drastic booms and busts that would have made generational effects irrelevant anyway. Consequently, no Easterlin cycles were detected prior to 1930. The heart of Easterlin's empirical evidence for his hypothesis comes from the period between 1930 and the 1960s or 1970s in the United States. During this period, all of the conditions on the checklist are present. In addition to a competitive labor market, tight restrictions appeared on immigration, and the government adopted a range of Keynesian economic policies designed to reduce the volatility of naturally occurring economic cycles and allow a long period of steadier economic growth. With all of these conditions checked off on the list, Easterlin was able to discover and to describe the connection between relative cohort size, economic consequences, and resulting trends in birth rates that have come to bear his name. Some of these conditions on the checklist persisted in the last decades of the 20th century as well in the United States, but one important element on the list changed when the country reopened its doors to a new wave of immigration that has persisted right down to the present. This may have been one of the reasons why Easterlin cycles did not persist into the 1980s and beyond. Research by Pampel and others compared these U.S. patterns to evidence from other countries, and Pampel in particular found evidence in Western Europe that when government policies went beyond the Keynesian tinkering with monetary and fiscal policies, more permanent welfare state programs also tended to damp out potential Easterlin cycles by weakening the link between cohort size and labor market consequences. In addition, although Pampel did not consider it, countries in Western Europe have exhibited changing policies about importing immigrant labor from outside their borders, and these changes also could confuse the picture when looking for Easterlin cycles. When I extended this comparative research to Eastern Europe, the checklist item for strong restrictions on labor migration obviously was present this time, even more strongly than it had been in the United States in the mid-20th century. We only need to think of the Berlin Wall to understand this. But the other items on the checklist became almost unrecognizable in the context of state socialist governments and economies. Government policies based on communist ideology essentially eliminated the entire concept of a competitive labor market, one of the foundations for Easterlin's entire theoretical framework. In the state socialist system as it developed under Communist Party control in the region after World War II, the government basically owned all firms, from the corner laundromat to the largest steel mills, and from the collectivized farms in the countryside to the taxi cabs and bakeries and telephone lines. The state built and allocated the housing that people lived in. Virtually everyone in the paid labor force was a government employee, and once you were out of school, the state guaranteed that everyone would be able to find one of these government jobs. They could always just make more of them whenever they were needed. In fact, it became illegal to be unemployed because that meant you were a parasite living off the other people in the society. The state socialist government, controlled by the Communist Party, set wages and salaries for all workers at whatever levels they thought were appropriate. They set prices for all commodities and services, from a loaf of bread to a car or an operation in the hospital. The centrally defined 5-year plans told everyone what to produce and how much of it should be produced. As Janos Kornai's analysis showed, the Achilles heel of this planned economy was that nobody ever got any signals from a free market of competing buyers and sellers, so nobody ever knew whether the price of anything was too high, so that people wouldn't buy what had been produced, or too low, so that everybody would try to buy something and shortages would result. This led to tremendous waste of resources in inappropriate production that in many cases just went to waste. On top of the lack of any idea about whether prices were set efficiently, the fact that the government ran most of the businesses meant that nobody had to pay any serious attention to the idea of actually making a profit. If a company lost money, the government would always bail them out and pay their bills. If they bought too many raw materials and produced too many shoes or too much soap or a lot of clothes that nobody wanted to buy or wear, there was no penalty for the company or its managers. This is what Kornai called a soft budget constraint. It was really no constraint at all. The most important aspect of this soft budget constraint involved one of the resources that all firms have to purchase in order to operate as a business: the human resources of employees who work in it. Since they faced no real constraint on how many people they hired, managers were always happy to hire more and more people because that just gave them more people to boss around and made them look more important. The appetite for more workers was potentially infinite. This unlimited demand for more and more workers turns out to be crucial for understanding how cohort size might be connected to economic prosperity and variations in birth rates. as we will see next. Of an open, competitive labor market for Easterlin's hypothesis would be hard to overstate. In most discussions of the relative cohort size effect, this most basic underlying assumption is hardly mentioned at all, but this is a case similar to the old saying that the last thing that a fish thinks about is the water. This competition to find jobs in an open marketplace is the motor that produces different outcomes based on differences in the sizes of small and large generations. Easterlin's premise is that small cohorts represent a drop in the supply of labor. They compete less with each other for jobs, while employers must compete more with each other to hire members of this lucky generation who are in scarce supply. Wages and salaries rise while unemployment rates drop. The members of the small generation enjoy increasing prosperity. The other side of this coin is that the large cohorts provide an oversupply of labor. They must compete more with each other for jobs, and employers can relax and wait for workers to flock to their doors. Wages and salaries increase only slowly, if at all, and unemployment increases. In both cases, the career prospects of young workers emerge from their experiences in the competitive open labor market. The final link in Easterlin's chain of logic then simply connects the economic hardships of large cohorts to their later marriages and smaller families, and the economic prosperity of small cohorts to their earlier marriages and larger families. The only step remaining in order to predict repeating cycles involves starting out with one small cohort followed by one large cohort. This sequence then might alternate on into the future. By comparison, if we want to import this kind of thinking into the state socialist countries of Eastern Europe in the late 20th century, we have to make some radical changes right from the outset. We can start with the same sequence of a small cohort followed by a large cohort in many of these countries, because the Great Depression that produced a small generation was felt around the world and reduced birth rates everywhere in the 1930s. But referring to Easterlin's original logical sequence, we already run into trouble at the first step for these cohorts because there's no competitive labor market. In a planned economy, the planners look at the number of students in schools and universities and count up how many people will be graduating. From this, they know how many jobs to arrange for in all those state-owned industries and businesses, and when people get out of school, their jobs are there, ready for them. The wages and salaries may be arbitrarily set by government bureaucrats, but everybody gets a job. Or as one Hungarian colleague observed to me, the government pretends to pay us and we pretend to work. The whole idea of an open and competitive labor market, complete with potential unemployment and such problems, is simply planned right out of the picture. Absence of the open, competitive labor market means that there's no longer any particular advantage to individuals for belonging to a small cohort coming into the labor force. There's no particular penalty for being part of a large cohort either. Small cohort or large, everybody gets a government job. In fact, János Kornai believed that exactly the opposite would happen instead. Large cohorts starting their working lives would expand the total size of the labor force. Since everybody always got a job, the large cohort meant more workers making things, providing services, getting paychecks and spending them. Expanding the size of the labor force simply expanded the whole economy. Output of every kind increased, and people could enjoy more products and services. This would be true not only for the large contingent of new workers, but also for everybody else in the economy. Such expansion was good for everybody all at the same time. On the other hand, when a small cohort came along, there would be fewer new workers than usual showing up for all those government jobs every year. This would make it harder for the government-owned firms to find new people to hire, so they would not be able to expand as fast. The labor shortage would create production bottlenecks and slow down the growth of the entire economy. Such a slowdown was bad for everybody all at the same time, not only the small cohort itself that had caused the problem of a labor shortage. It is important to stress that these structural effects of large generations expanding the whole economy and small generations slowing down the whole economy had an impact at the national level on the whole population. These effects were not limited to any particular cohorts of people, and they were not related in any way to the employment problems of individual people because there were no such problems. Remember, everybody always got a job, and it was technically illegal to be unemployed unless you were disabled. You may have noticed that these structural effects of generation size operating directly without any intermediate step from a non-existent competitive labor market turn out to be the opposite of what they were in Easterlin's original model. This is why I said in the article that in Eastern Europe we must think of Easterlin standing on his head. And since the economic consequences of cohort size operate in reverse in these state socialist economies, the results for birth rates also should be reversed. The economic expansion caused by a large new entry cohort of workers should predict higher birth rates. Since these new workers are in the heart of the childbearing ages, this means they are the ones who should be having higher fertility. On the other side of the coin, the slowdown that accompanied a small new entry cohort of workers should make them more careful and less optimistic and lower their fertility. It is still the Easterlin hypothesis, but the predictions we get from it in this state socialist context are completely backwards from what we saw in free market economies. Since these structural economic effects are felt by everybody in the state socialist economy, not just by the small or large cohort of new workers, there's no point any longer to calculate the measure of relative cohort size as Easterlin suggested it. That measure was based on the idea that people in these small and large cohorts were competing with each other for scarce jobs. The size of these cohorts still matters, but we need a new measure of its impact. In this case, we simply compare all the new young workers entering the labor force to the older workers leaving the labor force at retirement ages in the same year. A small new cohort, minus the people leaving work at retirement ages, will reduce the growth rate of the labor force, or perhaps even stop its growth altogether if the small cohort is small enough. If more people retire than start working, the labor force actually could shrink, which in state socialist economies would cause the whole economy to slide backwards. On the other hand, a large new cohort will magnify the difference between these entrances and exits, meaning that the labor force, and as a result the whole economy, will expand faster than usual. This should mean that when a large cohort pours into the working ages, the economy should boom and birth rates should go up. When a small cohort comes along to start working, the economy should stagnate and birth rates should slow down. Now that we have Easterlin standing on his head in this strange new Alice in Wonderland context of state socialist economies, all we need to do is assemble some data and see whether any of these patterns actually show up in Eastern Europe in the second half of the 20th century. Hungary, since that was where I started to gather the data for this analysis. The solid line in this chart shows the total fertility rate, or TFR, for the country in each year, starting right after World War II, when the Communist Party first came to power throughout the region, and ending a little over 40 years later. The dotted line in the chart shows the rate of expansion of the labor force, as already explained. This rate is higher when a large cohort is entering the working ages, and slower when a small cohort is entering the working ages. This is the first chart that appeared on my computer that day in Paris when I realized that something was up with Easterlin in Eastern Europe. So what do we see here? There are two kinds of changes that we should try to sort out from each other in these results. First, there are long-term trends or swings in both fertility and labor force values. These are the trends that we want to examine to see whether they fit any sort of Easterlin hypothesis, either the original version or with Easterlin standing on his head. But there are also some brief temporary oscillations, particularly in the total fertility rate, that are much too short to be the result of any kind of long-term cohort processes. We will have to account for these in most cases as caused by short-term, and usually short-sighted, government attempts to get people to have more babies. After all, in these state socialist economies, the only way to get economic growth was by expanding the labor force itself, and for that you need more people, starting with more babies. In Hungary, the long-term trends look pretty good. In the early post-war period, smaller and smaller birth cohorts from the Depression era were entering the labor force until the mid-1960s, and the TFR also followed a generally downward trend during these years, reaching a low point a few years after the slowest period of growth for the labor force. There is the matter of a strange spike in the TFR in the late 1950s, but we'll come back to that in a minute. This is one of those temporary oscillations we have to deal with. Then from about 1960 to the mid-1970s, the labor force grew faster and faster, and in general, fertility also rose parallel with it, although again there's a short little wiggle in the middle of this TFR increase. In the mid-1970s, labor force growth peaked and then began to slow down again for the next decade. And after a lag of a couple years, the fertility rate also turned around and followed the labor force curve down. So in general, we have a reasonably good picture of Easterlin standing on his head in Hungary. Birth rates rise when the labor force is growing faster and decline when the labor force growth slows down due to entry of small cohorts. But what about those disconcerting little wiggles in the TFR curve? For example, after the low point in the early 1960s, fertility suddenly jumped up sharply, then fell back for a couple of years, and then jumped up again to the mid-1970s peak. The first peak was due to policy changes by the Hungarian government, including introduction of more family benefits for people having children. The much larger spike in the early 1950s stemmed from a similar policy initiative by the government. In that case, also involving new restrictions on induced abortions to try to get more births. In both cases, though, these policy efforts mainly affected the timing of births, not so much the eventual number of children that people had. The government actions tended to pile up some people's births earlier than they otherwise might have happened, but then this caused a deficit shortly afterwards since these births were not happening when they might have in the first place. If these short-term dislocations in the timing of births were shifted back to where they otherwise might have happened, the TFR curve would fit even more closely to the long-term trends in the rate of labor force growth. In the Czech Republic, we see a similar trend of long swings in the rate of growth of the labor force, slower and slower after the war until the late 1950s, then faster and faster until the early 1970s, then another roller coaster downturn during the 1970s, and a second upturn in the mid-1980s, all due to the arrival of alternating smaller and larger cohorts entering the working ages over these decades. For the first 20 years or so, the TFR appears to move in tandem with labor force growth, reaching a low point around 1960 and then starting upward again together. Likewise, beginning again in the early 1970s, both series were falling together again. The obvious problem in this case, though, is to imagine a rise in the TFR that might have paralleled the peak in labor force growth around 1970, something seems to have taken a huge bite out of it, leaving a crater such as we might find after the top blows off a volcanic mountain peak. The teeth of this bite reached deepest into the TFR in 1968. Now, what happened in the Czech Republic in 1968? The arrival of a massive invasion of Soviet tanks and soldiers comes to mind, as the Warsaw Pact crushed the Prague Spring and set the country back on Moscow's track of socialist reality. We might guess that it is a little more difficult to concentrate on having babies when there's a Russian tank parked in the street outside your window. What might have been the course of the TFR without the Soviet invasion of the country in 1968? We'll never know, but this certainly qualifies as something that could disrupt an Easterlin cycle, either regular or inverted. The case of Romania is at once even clearer than the first two countries, but also more dramatic in its special odd feature. As usual, we see the region-wide long swings in the rate of labor force growth, slowing gradually until the mid-1960s, then speeding up again until the early 1970s, and then the cycle repeats with another slowdown and another speed up in the 1980s. The TFR follows along pretty faithfully with these cycles, with two exceptions. At the very end of the state socialist period in 1989 and 1990, as the entire political and economic system was falling to pieces all around them, we should not be surprised that Romanians may have been too worried about the future to have a lot of babies. The arrival of large new cohorts no longer resulted in automatic expansion of the economy because the whole economy had collapsed. But the real star of this show is the incredible spike of births in 1968 and 1969, which then disappeared again almost completely and immediately within a couple of years. This is a famous episode in demographic history. The megalomaniac leader of the country, Nicolae Ceausescu, suddenly decided that Romania needed more babies, so he ordered an instant end to all abortions, contraceptives, and anything else that could keep people from having babies. Women who were already pregnant and thinking of abortions had no choice but to have these births. but the Romanian people reacted very quickly and adjusted their behavior to get right back on track with the underlying trend in labor force growth. Again, the inverted Easterlin hypothesis fits in general if we could ignore the bizarre fluctuations caused by drastic government actions. The final chart presented here shows Bulgaria, where there were no invasions or crazy policies from crazy leaders. And in Bulgaria, all we need to know in order to predict the course of the total fertility rate is the corresponding trend in the growth of the labor force. In the post-war period, the country endured a long spell of slowing labor force growth as the smaller birth cohorts of the Great Depression came online in the working ages. But then labor force growth stabilized for the next several decades, and so did the TFR in the country. The two series move in virtual unison throughout the entire examined time periods, providing a very nice illustration of the inverted Easterlin hypothesis. These four countries in Eastern Europe each provide some support for the inverted Easterlin hypothesis, derived by adding the insights of János Kornai about how state socialist economies operated, to the also explore patterns for Poland and Slovakia in the article, but neither of these countries fits either the original or inverted Easterlin hypothesis at all. The article offers all kinds of after-the-fact speculations for why this might be the case, but I must confess to you that this was just making excuses the same way that Easterlin did for the lack of rising U.S. birth rates in the 1980s. I really have no idea why these other countries did not fit the theory of the inverted Easterlin hypothesis. Maybe you will be the one someday to come up with a better, more complete explanation that fits these puzzling cases more successfully.